By sunrise, 300 men would surround Marcus Reed's ranch, and the billionaire who sent them thought the fight was already over. The first hint that something was wrong came before dawn. Marcus was standing on the wooden porch of his ranch in eastern Montana, a steaming mug of black coffee warming his hands against the cold morning air. The horizon was still dark, the stars fading slowly above the rolling fields that had belonged to his family for nearly 70 years. A gentle wind swept across the tall grass, carrying the scent of earth and pine. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before. The weathered barn stood quietly near the fence line. The American flag hanging beside the porch swayed softly in the breeze. The horses in the pasture moved lazily through the morning fog. Yet Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Maybe it was the phone call from the previous afternoon. Maybe it was the expression on Richard Calloway's face when he had refused the offer one final time. Richard wasn't used to hearing the word no. Most people in Montana knew who he was. A billionaire real estate developer from California with plans to transform thousands of acres of untouched land into a luxury destination. Over the past 18 months, Richard had purchased nearly every ranch, farm, and property within 50 miles. Families who had lived there for generations packed their belongings and moved away. Old barns were demolished. Fence lines disappeared. New roads appeared where cattle once grazed. Money had changed everything, except for one property. Marcus Reed's ranch sat directly in the center of Richard's planned development. Without it, the project remained incomplete. For nearly a year, lawyers, brokers, consultants, and executives had visited the ranch carrying increasingly larger offers. First it was $2 million, then $5 million, then $8 million. By the end, Richard personally offered $12 million for the land. $12 million. More money than Marcus could spend in several lifetimes. But every time the answer stayed the same. No. The final meeting had happened less than 24 hours earlier. Richard arrived in a black SUV accompanied by attorneys and advisors. He walked through the ranch with the confidence of a man who believed everything had a price. Marcus remembered standing beside the old fence his father had built decades ago while Richard held out the final contract. "This is the last offer," Richard had said. "You'd be a wealthy man by sunset." Marcus had glanced toward the distant hills where his parents were buried beneath a pair of simple stone markers overlooking the valley. Then he folded the contract and handed it back. "My father spent his entire life protecting this land," he said quietly. "I'm not selling." Richard stared at him for several long seconds. The smile on his face never completely disappeared, but something colder settled behind his eyes. "Everyone changes their mind eventually," he replied. Then he climbed into his vehicle and drove away. Now, standing alone on the porch before sunrise, Marcus watched the eastern sky begin to brighten. He took another sip of coffee and listened to the silence. It didn't last. Far in the distance, somewhere beyond the hills, a faint sound reached him. Low, steady, mechanical. Marcus lowered the mug slowly. At first he thought it was thunder rolling across the plains. But the sky was clear. Then the sound grew louder. One engine became several. Several became dozens. The vibration traveled through the ground beneath his boots. Marcus stepped forward to the edge of the porch and looked toward the long gravel road leading to his property. What he saw made him freeze. Headlights. Hundreds of them. Stretching across the horizon like a river of white light moving through the darkness. Vehicle after vehicle appeared over the ridge. Pickup trucks. SUVs. Jeeps. More than he could count. Dust rose behind them as they advanced toward the ranch. Marcus set the coffee mug down on the railing without taking his eyes off the approaching convoy. He didn't know who they were. He didn't know why they were coming. But as the first rays of sunlight broke across the Montana plains, one thing became painfully clear. 300 men were arriving at his ranch. And they were arriving all at once. Marcus did not move as the convoy rolled closer. The growing roar of engines echoed across the valley, bouncing off distant hills and cutting through the morning silence that usually belonged only to birds and wind. One by one, the vehicles descended from the ridge and followed the gravel road leading toward the ranch. Dust drifted behind them like a long gray curtain stretching across the prairie. For a brief moment, Marcus considered walking back inside the house. Not because he was afraid, but because he had spent most of his life avoiding attention. Attention usually brought complications. Complications usually brought trouble. Yet something deep inside told him to stay exactly where he was. So he remained on the porch, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, watching the line of vehicles continue to grow. Behind him stood the ranch house his father built with his own hands nearly 5 decades earlier. The wood siding had faded under countless Montana winters. The front steps creaked in familiar places. The porch railing still carried the marks of old repairs made after storms. To most people, it looked like an aging ranch house sitting on valuable land. To Marcus, it was something entirely different. Every board held a memory. Every acre carried a story. His father, Samuel Reed, had purchased the property in 1958 after returning from military service. Back then, few people believed a black veteran could successfully operate a ranch in that part of the country. Some neighbors doubted him. Others quietly expected him to fail. Samuel never argued. He simply worked. Before sunrise each morning, he repaired fences, cleared fields, cared for livestock, and built a life for his family one season at a time. Marcus could still remember following his father through the pastures as a child. He remembered learning how to mend broken fence wire, how to read changing weather patterns, how to respect both land and people. More importantly, he remembered the lesson his father repeated more than any other. Land was not just property. Land was legacy. You did not inherit it from the past. You borrowed it from the future. That lesson stayed with Marcus through every chapter of his life. It followed him into military service. It followed him through deployments overseas. It followed him back home after retirement. And it followed him when his father passed away 6 years earlier. During the final weeks of Samuel's life, father and son spent countless evenings sitting on this very porch watching the sunset spread across the valley. On one of those evenings, Samuel pointed toward the fields glowing gold beneath the fading light. "Promise me something," he had said. Marcus never forgot the look in his father's eyes. Not fear. Not sadness. Conviction. The kind earned through a lifetime of sacrifice. "Do not let anyone convince you that everything has a price," Samuel told him. "Some things are worth more than money." Marcus made that promise without hesitation. Now, standing on the same porch years later, he wondered what his father would think if he could see the valley today. Nearly every neighboring ranch had changed ownership. New survey markers dotted the landscape. Construction crews had already begun preparing sections of land for future development. The old community that once filled these hills was slowly disappearing. Yet the Reed Ranch remained exactly where it had always been. Unmoved, unchanged, unwilling to surrender. The first vehicles finally reached the outer fence line. Marcus narrowed his eyes as sunlight spilled across the valley floor. There were far more vehicles than he originally thought. Hundreds of them now stretched along the road in both directions. Whoever they were, they had come from all over the country. Then something unexpected caught his attention. None of the vehicles carried company logos. None belonged to construction crews. None resembled the expensive corporate convoy Richard Calloway usually traveled with. Marcus stared quietly as the lead truck approached the front gate. And for the first time that morning, confusion replaced certainty. The lead truck rolled to a stop just outside the ranch gate. Then another stopped behind it. And another. Within minutes, the entire road seemed frozen beneath a sea of parked vehicles stretching far beyond the ridge. Morning sunlight reflected across windshields and chrome bumpers, scattering bright flashes of light across the valley. Marcus remained on the porch, his expression calm, but his mind worked carefully through every possibility. He knew Richard Calloway had resources. He knew powerful people rarely accepted defeat gracefully. Yet nothing about this scene matched what he expected. There were no construction crews unloading equipment. No legal representatives carrying documents. No media vans waiting to capture a public surrender. Instead, men stepped out of trucks one at a time and simply stood beside their vehicles. Some wore work boots and denim jackets. Others wore baseball caps faded by years of sun. A few appeared older, their gray hair catching the morning light. They came from different places, different backgrounds, different generations. Yet somehow they all shared the same quiet presence. Nobody shouted. Nobody rushed forward. Nobody crossed the fence line. Marcus noticed something else. Many of them were looking directly at the ranch house, not with hostility, but with recognition, as though they had traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles to see something important. A memory stirred somewhere in the back of his mind, but he could not yet place it. Then his attention shifted toward a black SUV approaching from the opposite direction. Unlike the others, this vehicle moved quickly. The moment Marcus saw it, he recognized it immediately. Richard Calloway had arrived. The billionaire's SUV pulled onto a small rise overlooking the property before stopping. Even from a distance, Marcus could see Richard step out and survey the enormous gathering. At first, the man appeared satisfied, confident, victorious, the expression of someone who believed events were unfolding exactly as planned. After all, Richard had spent years getting what he wanted. Entire towns had changed because he demanded it. Businesses had moved because he requested it. Landowners had accepted his offers because resisting seemed pointless. It was not difficult to imagine him assuming these hundreds of men had somehow become part of the pressure campaign. Marcus watched Richard remove a pair of sunglasses and look across the valley. The billionaire exchanged a few words with one of his assistants. Then something changed. The confidence faded. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. Richard looked again toward the vehicles. Then he looked a third time. The assistant beside him appeared confused. Richard did not answer whatever question had been asked. Instead, he stared toward the lead truck parked nearest the ranch gate. A door opened. A tall man stepped out. He looked to be in his late 30s, broad-shouldered, carrying himself with the quiet discipline of someone accustomed to responsibility. The man wore a simple brown jacket and faded jeans. Nothing about his appearance suggested wealth or status. Yet the moment Richard saw him, the color seemed to drain from his face. Marcus noticed the reaction immediately. For the first time since arriving, Richard appeared genuinely unsettled. The tall man closed the truck door and looked across the field. His eyes settled on the ranch house, then on Marcus standing alone on the porch. For several seconds, neither man moved. The valley seemed to fall completely silent. Even the wind felt quieter. Then the stranger began walking toward the gate. Richard took a step forward as if trying to stop him. But he did not call out. He did not move any closer. He simply watched. Marcus narrowed his eyes as the man approached. Something about the face seemed familiar. Not from Montana. Not from town. Somewhere else. Somewhere far away. The stranger reached the gate, placed one hand on the weathered wooden post, and smiled. And suddenly Marcus remembered exactly who he was. The man standing at the gate was Ethan Calloway. The realization hit Marcus like a memory carried across years of distance and silence. The last time he had seen Ethan, they had both been much younger. Back then, Ethan had not been standing in a quiet Montana valley beneath a clear morning sky. He had been a newly assigned serviceman trying to prove himself, carrying more determination than experience. Marcus remembered long days, difficult terrain, endless responsibility, and a young man who refused to quit even when circumstances became overwhelming. Time had changed Ethan's appearance. There were more lines around his eyes now. More confidence in the way he carried himself. But the steady gaze was exactly the same. Ethan rested one hand on the gate and smiled again. "Good morning, Marcus." Marcus stepped off the porch and slowly crossed the yard. The grass was still wet with morning dew. His boots left dark impressions in the ground as he approached. For a moment, neither man spoke. The years between them seemed to hang silently in the cool air. Then Ethan extended his hand. Marcus looked at it for half a second before pulling him into a firm embrace. Both men laughed softly. The sound carried across the quiet valley. Around them, hundreds of strangers watched respectfully from a distance. "It has been a long time," Ethan said. "Too long," Marcus replied. They stepped back and studied each other. Ethan shook his head with a smile. "You have not changed." Marcus glanced toward the endless line of vehicles filling the road. "I could say the same thing, but I have a feeling you did not drive all the way to Montana by yourself." Ethan laughed. "No, definitely not." Marcus looked beyond him toward the crowd. Men continued arriving from every direction. Some carried travel bags. Others leaned casually against their trucks. Many appeared to know each other. Some greeted old friends. Others simply stood quietly waiting. The entire scene felt less like a confrontation and more like a reunion that had somehow materialized overnight. Marcus turned back toward Ethan. "What is all this?" Before Ethan could answer, movement on the hillside drew both men's attention. Richard Calloway had left his vehicle and was now walking down toward the gathering. Two assistants followed closely behind him. The billionaire's expression had become increasingly difficult to read. Confusion had replaced confidence. Confidence had given way to concern. Now concern seemed dangerously close to disbelief. Ethan noticed him approaching, and his smile disappeared. Not because of anger. Because he suddenly understood exactly what Richard thought was happening. Richard stopped several yards away. His eyes moved from Ethan to Marcus and back again. "Ethan," he finally said. The single word sounded almost unreal. Ethan turned calmly. "Hello, Dad." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had happened all morning. Marcus glanced between them. Suddenly, several pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Richard looked stunned. Completely stunned. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Ethan folded his arms. "I could ask you the same question." Richard looked toward the hundreds of vehicles surrounding the property. "You organized this?" Ethan glanced behind him. "No." Richard frowned. "Then who did?" Ethan smiled faintly. "You are asking the wrong question." The billionaire's confusion deepened. Ethan looked across the crowd. Men from every corner of the country stood beneath the growing sunlight. Some wore military caps. Some wore jackets displaying old service patches. Others carried small flags attached to their vehicles. One thing connected them all. Every face seemed familiar to someone standing nearby. Ethan finally answered. "The real question is why they came." Richard stared across the gathering. For the first time, he began noticing details he had completely overlooked. And what he saw made his expression slowly change once again. Richard stood motionless as realization slowly worked its way across his face. The crowd gathered around the ranch was not behaving like hired workers, investors, or contractors. Nobody was waiting for instructions. Nobody was carrying blueprints. Nobody appeared interested in development projects or business negotiations. Instead, people greeted each other with the familiarity of old friendships. Some shook hands. Others exchanged smiles across the rows of parked vehicles. It looked less like an operation and more like a gathering built on something far stronger than money. Richard scanned the crowd again. This time he noticed details that had escaped him before. Military service caps from different branches. Small decals displayed in truck windows. Unit insignias attached to jackets. Commemorative license plates from states scattered across the country. Texas, Florida, Virginia, Colorado, Arizona, Tennessee. Men had traveled hundreds and in some cases thousands of miles to be here. For a long moment nobody spoke. Then a gray-haired man stepped forward from the crowd. He appeared to be in his late 60s and walked with the quiet confidence of someone completely comfortable in his own skin. He approached Marcus first and extended his hand. Marcus smiled immediately. "Tom Henderson." The older man laughed. "You still remember everybody. You were impossible to forget." Another man approached moments later. Then another. Then another. One by one they came forward. Some Marcus recognized instantly. Others took a moment. Years had passed. Hair had turned gray. Faces had changed. Yet the memories remained. Each greeting revealed another connection stretching back through decades of shared experiences, difficult assignments, long journeys, and acts of service. Richard watched the process unfold in growing disbelief. The gathering was no accident. None of these people had arrived randomly. They had come from Marcus. A younger man wearing a faded navy cap stopped in front of Marcus and smiled. "You probably do not remember me." Marcus studied him carefully. "Jackson Miller, North Carolina. We met at Walter Reed in 2011. The man's eyes widened. "You remembered." Marcus shrugged lightly. "Of course." Jackson shook his head. "I told my wife you would remember." Nearby, several men laughed. The atmosphere continued changing. What had seemed intimidating from a distance now felt strangely warm. Vehicles remained parked across the valley, but nobody acted aggressively. Instead, stories began circulating through small groups of people. Names were exchanged. Memories resurfaced. Old photographs appeared on phone screens. The ranch that had felt isolated only hours earlier now felt alive. Ethan stepped beside Marcus and looked across the gathering. "Do you know how this started?" Marcus shook his head. "No." Ethan smiled. "A message." Richard listened carefully. Ethan continued. "Someone heard that you were being pressured to sell the ranch. They told someone else. That person told another. Then another. Within a few days the message spread farther than anyone expected." Marcus frowned slightly. "What message?" Ethan looked around at the hundreds of men now standing throughout the valley. That a good man might need to stand alone. Marcus glanced across the crowd again. Suddenly he understood. None of these people had come because he asked. None had received formal invitations. They came because they remembered. Not achievements. Not medals. Not titles. They remembered kindness, advice, encouragement. Moments when Marcus helped someone expecting nothing in return. Richard remained silent. Every passing minute seemed to challenge something he had always believed. Throughout his life, influence had been measured by wealth, contracts, ownership, and power. Yet standing before him was evidence of an entirely different kind of influence. One that could not be purchased. One that could not be negotiated. One that had been earned slowly over decades. Then Ethan reached into his jacket and removed his phone. "There is one thing you should see." Marcus looked puzzled. Ethan handed him the device. On the screen was a message viewed thousands of times over the previous week. Marcus read the first sentence. His expression immediately changed, because he recognized the sender, and the words had been written by someone he had not heard from in nearly 15 years. Marcus stared at the phone for several seconds before reading the message again. The sender's name alone was enough to pull him backward through years of memories. Daniel Brooks. The two of them had not spoken in nearly 15 years. Life had carried them in different directions after service. Families, careers, responsibilities, and distance had gradually turned regular conversations into holiday messages and eventually silence. Yet there it was, a message written only 6 days earlier. Ethan watched quietly while Marcus continued reading. Around them, the valley seemed calmer now. The morning sun had climbed higher above the hills, bathing the ranch in warm golden light. The cool air carried the scent of grass and earth. Men stood talking in small groups throughout the property, but no one interrupted. Somehow everyone sensed that this moment mattered. Marcus finally looked up from the screen. "Daniel started this." Ethan nodded. He heard what was happening through an old contact. Marcus lowered the phone slightly. "I have not talked to him in years." That did not seem to matter. Ethan smiled. The message spread faster than anyone expected. Marcus looked back at the screen. The words were simple. There were no dramatic speeches, no demands, no requests for confrontation. Only a short message shared among friends. If Marcus Reed is standing alone, then he should not have to stand alone. That was all. One sentence. Yet somehow it had traveled across dozens of states. Through phone calls, emails, text messages, veterans groups, family networks, and old friendships. One sentence had become 300 vehicles parked outside a ranch in Montana. Marcus slowly exhaled. For the first time that morning, emotion appeared on his face. Not shock, not pride, gratitude. Ethan looked across the valley. "You know what surprised me?" Marcus shook his head. Ethan pointed toward the crowd. "Half these people never served with you." Marcus frowned slightly. Ethan continued. "Some know someone you helped. Some are relatives of people whose lives you changed. Others only heard stories." Nearby, an older man joined the conversation. "My son is here because of you." Marcus looked confused. The man smiled. "You probably do not remember him. Most people would not." Marcus laughed softly. "Try me." The man folded his arms. 12 years ago, a young man struggling after leaving service. Lost. Angry. Convinced nobody cared what happened to him. Marcus studied the man's face. Slowly recognition appeared. "Michael." The older man nodded proudly. "My son." Marcus smiled immediately. "How is he?" The answer came from behind him. "Doing pretty well these days." Marcus turned. A man in his 30s stepped forward from the crowd, carrying a small boy on his shoulders. The child waved excitedly. Michael smiled. "Married. 2 kids. Own a business now." Marcus laughed and shook his hand. More people began approaching, one after another. Stories emerged from every direction. A recommendation letter written years earlier. A phone call made at the right moment. Advice shared during difficult times. Quiet acts of support that Marcus himself barely remembered. Yet others remembered. Very clearly. Richard stood several yards away listening to everything. No one paid much attention to him anymore. The billionaire found himself surrounded by something entirely unfamiliar. He had spent decades building influence through acquisitions, contracts, negotiations, and financial leverage. Yet standing before him was a different kind of success. A legacy measured not in dollars, but in people. For the first time all morning, Richard looked away from the crowd and toward the ranch house. The weathered porch, the faded paint, the old barn. The land he had treated as a business obstacle suddenly looked different. He could see why Marcus refused to sell. This was not merely property. It was history. It was family. It was identity. The realization settled heavily over him. Then a familiar voice broke the silence. "Dad." Richard looked up. Ethan stood directly in front of him. The expression on his son's face was calm, but serious. "There is something you need to know." Richard nodded slowly. Ethan glanced toward Marcus before looking back at his father. "The reason I am standing here today is because of him." Richard frowned slightly, unsure what Ethan meant. But as his son began speaking, the entire valley seemed to grow quiet once again. Ethan held his father's gaze for several long seconds before speaking. The confidence and warmth he had shown throughout the morning faded, replaced by something deeper. Respect. Gratitude. The kind that could only come from years of reflection. Around them, conversations gradually quieted. People sensed an important story was about to be told. Even the distant sounds of laughter and conversation seemed to fade beneath the bright Montana sky. Richard folded his arms. "What do you mean?" Ethan glanced toward Marcus, who stood quietly near the fence line speaking with several old friends. "I mean exactly what I said. The reason I am standing here today is because of him." Richard looked confused. "You have always spoken highly of him, but I do not understand." Ethan nodded slowly. "That is because there is a part of the story I never told you." Richard's expression softened. He had spent years wondering why his son held Marcus in such high regard. He knew they had served together. He knew they respected each other. But beyond that, Ethan had rarely discussed those years in detail. Now, for the first time, he seemed ready to explain. Ethan looked across the valley before continuing. "There was a time in my life when I thought I had all the answers. I was young, ambitious, determined to prove myself." He smiled faintly. "Probably a lot like you when you started your first company." Several people nearby chuckled. Richard managed a small smile. Ethan continued. "I believed strength meant never asking for help. I believed success came from pushing harder than everyone else." He paused. "Then reality taught me something different." Richard listened carefully. "There was a period when I struggled, more than anyone around me realized. I kept it hidden because I thought that was what I was supposed to do." Ethan looked down briefly before raising his eyes again. "Most people never noticed. Marcus did." Richard remained silent. Ethan's voice grew steadier. He was never loud about it, never dramatic. He simply paid attention. He checked in when nobody else did. He listened when I needed someone to listen. He reminded me that asking for help is not weakness, that carrying everything alone is not strength. The billionaire's expression changed. Ethan rarely spoke so openly. "You never told me any of this." Ethan nodded. "I know." He smiled sadly. "At the time I did not tell anyone." The crowd remained completely still. Many faces showed recognition. They had their own versions of the same story. Ethan looked toward Marcus once more. "People think leadership is about giving orders. They think it is about titles, influence, or authority. Marcus taught me something different. Real leadership is noticing the person everyone else overlooks." A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. More than a few heads nodded. Ethan laughed softly. "I am not the only one. Look around." Richard did. Everywhere he looked he saw faces filled with admiration. Not because Marcus was famous. Not because he was wealthy. Because he had mattered to them personally. One conversation at a time. One act of kindness at a time. One moment at a time. Ethan took a deep breath. When word spread that someone was trying to force him off this land, people started making calls. Not because he asked us to. Because we owed him. Richard slowly looked around the valley again. Hundreds of people. Hundreds of stories. Hundreds of lives connected by one man standing quietly beside an old ranch fence. The realization landed with unexpected force. Richard had spent months seeing Marcus as an obstacle, a stubborn landowner refusing a profitable offer. Yet he had completely missed who Marcus actually was. He had measured him through the lens of business, contracts, acreage, negotiations. He never considered the possibility that the ranch represented something far greater than property. Ethan stepped closer to his father. "You thought this was about land." Richard swallowed slowly. Ethan shook his head. "It never was." The billionaire looked toward Marcus again. For the first time, he was not seeing a ranch owner or a former serviceman. He was seeing a man whose greatest legacy had nothing to do with titles, accomplishments, or wealth. And the weight of that realization settled heavily on his shoulders. For several minutes after Ethan finished speaking, nobody said much. The valley that had felt so alive with conversation earlier settled into a thoughtful silence. Sunlight spilled across the fields, turning the tall grass into waves of gold. A gentle breeze moved through the fence posts and cottonwood trees near the creek. Somewhere in the distance, one of the horses wandered lazily through the pasture. The ranch felt peaceful, timeless, almost untouched by the tension that had brought everyone there. Richard stood alone for a moment, staring at the ground. His assistants remained nearby, but wisely said nothing. There was nothing they could say. For the first time in many years, Richard found himself questioning assumptions he had never bothered to examine. He had built an empire by identifying value, land value, market value, investment value. Every decision came down to numbers, projections, and returns. It was a system that had made him extraordinarily successful. Yet standing in the middle of Marcus Reed's ranch, surrounded by hundreds of people who had traveled across America simply because one man mattered to them, Richard realized there was another kind of value his spreadsheets could never measure. Slowly, he began walking across the field. Conversations paused as people noticed him moving toward Marcus. Nobody blocked his path. Nobody challenged him. They simply watched. Marcus stood beside the old fence, listening to an elderly veteran tell a story that had everyone nearby laughing. When he saw Richard approaching, he politely excused himself and turned to face him. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The contrast between them seemed almost symbolic. One man had spent decades accumulating wealth. The other had spent decades building relationships. Yet in that moment, only one of them appeared truly rich. Richard looked around the ranch one final time. The barn, the house, the hills beyond the property. Then he looked back at Marcus. "I owe you an apology." The word surprised even him. Marcus remained silent, giving him space to continue. Richard took a slow breath. "I thought I understood why you refused every offer." He shook his head. "The truth is, I never even tried to understand." Marcus glanced toward the distant hills where his parents rested. Richard followed his gaze. "I saw acreage." His voice softened. "You saw family." Another long pause followed. The breeze moved gently through the grass between them. Richard folded his hands in front of him. "I spent months trying to convince you that selling would improve your future." He smiled sadly. "Meanwhile, I completely ignored your past." Marcus finally spoke. "The land was never the issue." Richard nodded. "I know that now." The billionaire looked across the crowd gathered around the ranch. "I have spent my whole life believing influence comes from power." He glanced at Ethan, then back at Marcus. "Today I learned it comes from people." Marcus smiled faintly. "Sometimes." Richard laughed quietly. "No, definitely." For the first time all morning, the tension between them disappeared. Not because they suddenly agreed about everything, but because understanding had finally replaced assumption. Richard reached into his jacket and removed a folder. The same folder that had contained the final purchase agreement. Without saying a word, he opened it. Then he carefully removed the documents and folded them shut. "The offer is withdrawn." Several people nearby exchanged surprised glances. Richard looked directly at Marcus. "Not because I cannot afford the land." He smiled. "Because some things should never have been for sale in the first place." Marcus stared at him for a moment before extending his hand. Richard accepted it immediately. The handshake lasted only a few seconds, but it carried more meaning than months of negotiations. Around them, smiles spread through the crowd. Ethan released a breath he had not realized he was holding. The conflict that had brought everyone together was finally over. Yet somehow it felt as though something much more important had just begun. By late afternoon, the gathering began to thin. One by one, people climbed back into their trucks and SUVs. Engines started. Doors closed. Tires rolled slowly across the gravel roads surrounding the ranch. There were no speeches, no ceremonies, and no grand farewell. None were needed. The reason they had come had already been fulfilled. They had shown up. They had stood together. And now they were heading home. Marcus spent the next few hours shaking hands, exchanging phone numbers, and listening to promises that this time they would not wait another decade before staying in touch. Laughter echoed across the property as old friends reunited for one last conversation before leaving. Several families took photographs near the ranch gate. Children chased each other through the grass, while parents shared stories about people they had not seen in years. The entire ranch felt transformed, not by money or construction, but by connection. As the sun drifted lower toward the western horizon, the golden light stretched across the valley and painted everything in warm shades of amber and copper. Ethan remained longer than most. He stood beside Marcus near the fence line, watching the final vehicles disappear into the distance. For several minutes, neither man spoke. They simply listened to the quiet returning to the land. Eventually, Ethan smiled. You know, when the first messages started spreading, I thought maybe 20 people would show up. Marcus laughed. I was thinking the same thing. Ethan shook his head. I definitely did not expect this. He gestured toward the empty road where hundreds of vehicles had stood only hours earlier. Marcus looked across the ranch. The fields were peaceful again. The horses grazed lazily beneath the fading sunlight. The old barn cast a long shadow across the pasture. Everything appeared exactly as it had the day before. Yet somehow it felt different. Not because anything physical had changed. Because he now understood something he had never fully appreciated. The people who arrived that morning had not come because of who he used to be. They came because of who he had chosen to be every day afterward. Ethan eventually hugged him goodbye and promised to return soon. This time Marcus believed him. After Ethan left, only a handful of vehicles remained. One of them belonged to Richard Calloway. The billionaire stood quietly near his SUV, looking out over the ranch. Before leaving, he walked over one final time. I wanted to say thank you. Marcus looked surprised. Richard smiled. Not for the handshake. He glanced toward the hills. For the lesson. Marcus shook his head lightly. I was not trying to teach anything. Richard laughed. That is usually how the best lessons work. They exchanged a final nod before Richard climbed into his vehicle and drove away. No contracts. No negotiations. No pressure. Just understanding. As evening settled over the valley, silence slowly reclaimed the ranch. The sky deepened into shades of orange and purple. A cool breeze moved through the grass. Marcus walked alone toward the small rise overlooking the property. At the top of the hill stood the simple stone markers belonging to his parents. He stopped there for a while, hands resting in his pockets. The setting sun illuminated the names carved into the weathered stone. Samuel Reed. Eleanor Reed. The people who had built everything surrounding him. Marcus smiled softly. The ranch is still here. The breeze stirred gently around him. Somewhere below, the American flag beside the porch fluttered quietly against the evening sky. He remained there until the final sunlight disappeared beyond the horizon. Then he turned and looked across the land one last time. The house stood where it always had. The barn remained unchanged. The fences stretched across the fields exactly as his father had built them. And near the entrance to the property, illuminated by the last traces of daylight, stood a wooden sign that had welcomed visitors for generations. Reed Family Ranch. Marcus took a slow breath and started walking home. Behind him, the valley settled into peaceful silence. Ahead of him, the porch light glowed warmly against the gathering darkness. Some things are worth more than money. And on that quiet Montana evening, nobody understood that better than Marcus Reed.